Hey everybody, Dr. O. Let's review the urinary system, all right? So to review, what should you already know about the kidneys? The hormones involved, the epithelium of the urinary system, the role in acid-base balance. So this isn't a huge deal, but the hormones are, but let's kind of skip that and come back. Epithelium, you're going to see, this is where you're going to see most of your cuboidal epithelium. Not a big deal, but that just seems to be where a lot of it hangs out. Role in acid-base balance. Pretty big. Your lungs, your respiratory system is I would say a number one player, 1A, 1B, whatever, because the carbon dioxide being a weak acid. But your kidneys do play a big role in maintaining pH balance, because if you have too much acid in your blood, you can shunt it to your kidneys. So like after a tough workout, the pH of your urine will go way down because you're getting all those extra acids out of your blood that way. Your kidneys can either secrete hydrogen ions if you have to get rid of them, or reabsorb them. So they play a major role there. Hormones involved. Quite a few. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, comes from the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary gland. It's an antidiuretic. It's going to open water channels, these aquaporin channels that reabsorb water, so you're going to make less urine. Aldosterone comes from your adrenal glands. It's going to cause you to reabsorb salt at your kidneys, sodium, and water is going to follow it. Again, to decrease urine production and increase blood volume and blood pressure. EPO, erythropoietin. That's a hormone that when the kidneys sense a drop in blood pressure, they'll tell your bone marrow to make more red blood cells. Let's see. Then we have also renin-angiotensin. So whether you classify this as a hormone or not, when your kidneys sense that drop in blood pressure, they'll release renin, which causes this cascade to angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, and that's going to be in here. But so I won't go into detail there. But in the end, it's going to raise your blood pressure. So all these things to keep your blood pressure up, and we'll explain why later. And then lastly, we have calcitriol. It does come from the kidneys. It works with parathyroid hormone. Its job is to make sure you're absorbing as much calcium as you can from the gut. So those are some of the hormones we've talked about in the past. All right, what are the three primary functions of your urinary system? So really maintaining blood volume and blood pressure. I know that sounds crazy because high blood pressure is such a big problem now, but for most of human history, losing blood was an issue and low blood pressure was a problem. So maintaining blood volume and blood pressure. And I'm not saying it can't help at all to lower blood pressure, but it's much better at raising it than lowering it. Second, maintaining blood pH, like we were just saying. If your blood pH climbs, then your kidneys are going to help get rid of that extra acid. If it climbs, your pH gets too high, it's going to hold on to acids. If your blood pH drops, it's going to get rid of those extra acids. And the third thing is to control plasma concentration. So urine is filtered blood. If you need to get rid of things, you dump it in the urine. If you need things, you bring them back in and don't let it form in your urine. So think about urine as filtered blood. So urine is a way to hold on to or get rid of things that we need or want to get rid of from our blood. All right. Can you follow a drop of fluid on its way from the blood to filtrate to tubular fluid to the urine to the toilet? If not, you should be able to. So as blood is flowing through your capillaries, they're going to reach the glomerulus, which will be that knot-like capillary, and the Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule that's going to capture it. So that's how the fluid's going to leave your blood and become filtrate as it's filtered in at these capsules. It becomes tubular fluid when it enters the proximal convoluted tubule. So whereas filtration is the primary function there at the glomerulus, or the renal corpuscle there, the proximal convoluted tubule's primary job is reabsorption. Then you have the loop of Henle, which we'll talk about. It increases the more water reabsorption and increases the concentration of the solutes in your urine. Then we have the distal convoluted tubule that secretes things. Then you have your collecting system. And that's how we get through a nephron. Then that fluid is going to be drained down a renal papilla into a lot of words here, but a lot of stuff we're going to cover. Minor calyx into a major calyx into the renal pelvis, and then the ureter, then the bladder, then the urethra, and the toilet. So again, we're going to cover all this later, but if you want like one big pass through of all the terminology involved, that's where you should do it. What's the proper term for urination? It is micturition. What does it mean that the kidneys are retroperitoneal? That means they're behind the peritoneal membrane. We talked about this with digestion. They're firmly attached to the posterior abdominal wall. They're stabilized in other ways, so they're behind the mesenteries and the visceral and parietal peritoneum, the peritoneal cavity. All right, know the key parts of the kidney from a sectional anatomy standpoint. So this is going to be, I have a few listed here, renal, pelvis, minor calyx, etc. So the urine that's being produced after it travels through the nephron and the collecting system is going to first enter a renal pyramid. And at the bottom of these renal pyramids is going to be a papilla or nipple-like structure that's basically dripping urine. So that's the first piece. That's going to drain into a minor calyx. These are just channel. It's a big funnel, and it's going to be funneling urine towards the ureters. So 2 or 3 of these minor calyces will drain into a major calyx, which will then drain to the renal pelvis. And that's the key. Renal pelvis is where urine leaves the kidneys. And the renal pelvis is then going to connect to a ureter. Your 2 ureters travel to the bladder. Then when you're ready to urinate, urine goes from the bladder through your urethra. So that's from a sectional anatomy standpoint. You have a video on that. This is the really important part to me. Know the key function of each part of the nephron. The renal corpuscle, the PCT, which is the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, or loop of Henle, Henle is how I learned it, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting system. So I don't want to overthink this. So the renal corpuscle is 2 ingredients, the glomerulus, which is a knot of capillaries, and the glomerular capsule, which was called the Bowman's capsule, and still is by some. So this knot of capillaries is going to flush fluid into this capsule, and you're going to produce 48 to 50 gallons of filtrate a day right there at the renal corpuscle. That's where filtration takes place. So in a word, key function, filtration. The proximal convoluted tubule, think reabsorption. You've got filters only care about size. So the good news is the renal corpuscle is where we filter out a bunch of small bad things. But there's 2 problems there. We can't filter out a lot of large bad things, and we filter out a lot of small good things. So the proximal convoluted tubule's job is reabsorption. We cannot afford to lose 50 gallons of filtrate. We cannot afford to lose all of our glucose and our amino acids, etc., etc. So the proximal convoluted tubule's job is to reabsorb. About 70% of that water is going to be reabsorbed, and almost 100% of those key small ingredients like amino acids and glucose. If they're not all being absorbed, it's probably because, as we'll get to in a later point, you've reached a transport maximum and you can't reabsorb anymore because there's way too much of it in your blood. So proximal convoluted tubule, think reabsorption. About 70% of that overall water is reabsorbed, and almost 100% of the small good things we don't want to lose. The nephron loop, you're going to absorb 20-30% more of that water back, so it's going to be reabsorbing even more water to help concentrate your urine, but we still have a lot of that to do. Distal convoluted tubule, think secretion. So things that we've got to get out of our body that weren't filtered out are going to be secreted here. So this is where like a lot of drugs and toxins will be secreted out. Then lastly, your collecting system, they're going to determine the final concentration and volume of your urine. So this is where like hormones like antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone and other factors are going to come in and say, okay, how much urine do we need to lose? Because we don't want to lose any, right? If we could pee dust, we would. But it's called obligatory water loss. We want to make sure we're not losing too much water. That's why I'm always telling students, what your urine looks like and how often you urinate tells you a lot about whether or not you're hydrated. Because if you have extra water, then your kidneys will allow extra water to leave. So your urine should be pale yellow or clear. If you have dark urine and you're not urinating very often, it tells you something. Your kidneys are holding on to every drop of water they can. So that's the collecting system's job. Let's review those because they're all important. Renal corpuscle, that glomerulus, that knot of capillaries, and that glomerular capsule. Filtration. Only thing it does, just filters out things that are small and fluid. Proximal convoluted tubule, think reabsorption. About 70% of that water is reabsorbed, and then almost everything else. Nephron loop, more water reabsorption to concentrate your urine. Distal convoluted tubule, think secretion. Collecting system determines the final composition and concentration of your urine. All right, there are 2 types of nephrons, which is more numerous and which is better at concentrating urine. So 85% of your nephrons, and the nephron we just went through, that's the functional unit of the kidney. So 85% of your nephrons are called cortical nephrons, so they're most numerous. But the ones that are better, and I can't show you them here, but the juxtamedullary nephrons have really long loops of Henle, or nephron loops, which means they're even better at concentrating your urine. So the cortical nephron is famous for being the most common. The juxtamedullary nephron is better at concentrating your urine. All right, how much filtrate is produced each day? How much fluid enters the collecting system? So we start at 48 to 50 gallons a day of filtrate is produced at the glomerulus there, from the glomerulus at the corpuscle. About 27 liters of that reaches the distal convoluted tubule. So obviously still way too much. A liter of urine is a full bladder. So imagine having one of them every hour or more. So that's where things like antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone kick in to reabsorb more of that water. So we start with 50 gallons of filtrate a day. 27 liters reaches that distal convoluted tubule, then less reaches the collecting system, and then in the end you only produce about a liter or 1 to 1.5 liters of urine a day. All right. What kind of cells create the filtration slits of the renal corpuscle? What are their false feet called? And what kind of capillary beds would be found here? So the cells are called podocytes, which really means cells with feet. Their false feet, as they're called, are pedicles, and they overlap with each other and form these slits that things that things can fit through if they're small enough. And what kind of capillaries? This goes back to our discussion of blood vessels. These would be called fenestrated capillaries. Fenestra means windows. So we kind of have these larger openings in our capillary beds. But this filtration membrane, so to be filtered out at that renal corpuscle, you have to be small enough to get through the fenestrated capillary, the filtration slits, and if you do, you will make it through as some of that 50 gallons of filtrate. Thankfully, most of the good stuff is brought back in. All right. We already mentioned this. What is the biggest weakness of the filtration slit / membrane? It filters out small good things too. So if we didn't reabsorb all this, we'd be dead really quickly because we'd be losing 50 gallons of fluid that we don't have. We'd lose all of our amino acids, all of our glucose, etc. So it's like I always jokingly say, we throw the baby out with the bathwater, but then we rapidly grab the baby and pull it back in. That's basically what happens because filtration is completely based on size here. All right, urea, and creatinine are the two key metabolic waste products that the kidney must deal with. Where do they come from? So we produce 21 grams a day of urea. That comes from the breakdown of amino acids. Anytime you use amino acids for something other than building proteins, you have to deal with the nitrogen. You have to take the amino group off of it. So if you're going to turn into glucose for fuel or something, so that's where we get this urea as a breakdown, as a byproduct of using amino acids in the body. Next, we have creatinine. So urea and creatinine are the two key metabolic waste products of the kidneys. We produce about 1.8 grams a day of creatinine. That comes from creatine phosphate, which is used to help power our muscles. So creatine phosphate can donate energy and phosphate to ATP to keep our muscles churning along. So that's where creatinine comes from. The third one I probably should have mentioned here is going to be uric acid. You make a little under 500 milligrams of uric acid a day. That's from the recycling of RNA primarily. But the reason I bring that up is because if you have too much uric acid, it can lead to gout, which is becoming a more and more common problem. All right, so the three key metabolic waste products are urea, creatinine, and uric acid. What is the renal threshold / transport maximum? So the transport maximum is how many receptors do you have and how fast can they move material. So your transport maximum determines your renal threshold. So whatever the transport maximum is, if there's more, so I always think of, I Love Lucy, she was working at a chocolate factory. The chocolate was coming by so fast, she was stuffing some in her blouse and all over the place because she couldn't keep up. Well, if that's the case with, let's say, glucose, for example, the renal threshold or transport maximum of glucose is about 180 milligrams per deciliter. So if somebody's blood sugar is higher than 180, so much glucose is being pushed into this fluid, and your transporters are pulling back in as fast as they can't pull it all back in. So once you've reached that transport maximum and all of your glucose receptors here are saturated, the excess is going to make it through and make it in your urine. So if somebody has glucose in their urine, we know their blood sugar must be 180 or higher. The transport maximum for amino acids is 65. So generally, if you eat a whole lot of protein, you might see some protein leak through, but because you can reach that transport maximum. So think of it that way. Is there so much of something in your blood that even though you have transporters that are designed to reabsorb it and usually do all of it, reabsorb all of it, there's so much in there that some's going to leak through and end up in your urine. That's why the urinalysis is still a very valuable test. We've got all sorts of biotechnology and genetic tests and all these cool things. A good old urine test can tell you a lot. All right, so that's the renal threshold and the transport maximum. What is glomerular filtration rate and what does it tell you? So your glomerular filtration rate is how much you filter through the kidneys per minute. So it's 125 milliliters a minute. That's how we get to that 48 to 50 gallons of filtrate a day. So if it's 180 liters if you add it up. But so if your kidneys are functioning at 100%, you should be able to filter that 48 to 50 gallons of filtrate a day. So what it tells you is whether or not your kidneys are functioning. So if your glomerular filtration rate is lower than that, it tells you there's something wrong with your kidneys, something wrong with your kidney function. All right, and it could be linked to blood supply and blood pressure, which is the next question. Why is a small drop in blood pressure at the kidneys disastrous? So here's what I would say. Your kidneys are they're powered by pressure, hydrostatic pressure. So think of like a slip and slide. We got a slip and slide in the backyard. If we don't turn the water all the way up, the water doesn't shoot everywhere it's supposed to in the slip and slide that we play with. So same with your kidneys. If you don't have enough pressure flowing through your kidneys, they can't work. So a 20% drop in renal blood pressure would turn them off, right? So a 20% drop in blood pressure in most parts of your body, you either wouldn't notice it or it wouldn't be disastrous. But a 20% drop in blood pressure in the kidneys will turn your GFR, your glomerular filtration rate, to 0. So that's why your kidneys are so worried about your blood pressure and they're so sensitive to it. If your blood pressure starts to drop, they're going to send out hormones to raise your blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why it's so important. All right, what percent of the filtrate that is produced a day is reabsorbed as a result of obligatory water reabsorption? So just so you know, we reabsorb most of it not because of like water channels. It's just called obligatory water reabsorption. Just has to do with osmosis. That's 85% is the number I'm looking for there. So we don't want to lose water. We do have to lose some. So we have obligatory water loss. But most of that 50 gallons of fluid is actually going to be reabsorbed, not because we're actively doing it. It's just part of how the kidneys function. So we purposely filter out too much fluid and then suck most of it back in. So 85% is reabsorbed as a result of obligatory water reabsorption. We absorb way more than 85%. Or else we would be drowning in our own urine. So, so the rest of it is going to actively be brought in with hormones and these types of things. All right, what role does ADH play in concentrating urine? We've already mentioned this, antidiuretic hormone. Without it, you would have a disease called diabetes insipidus. And without ADH, basically you'd produce 27 liters of urine a day instead of 1 to 1.5 liters of urine a day. If you want to know how ADH works, alcohol stops it from functioning. So if you've ever drank a lot of alcohol, breaking the seal is what the cool kids call it, I guess. I always like to say, if you drink 4 beers, alcohol is such a powerful diuretic because of this effect on antidiuretic hormone. If you drink 4 beers, you're going to pee out a 6-pack. Powerful, powerful diuretic. All right, the next point I'd already made so we're going to skip over that. I apologize. So, what is GFR? Why is it important? We've already done that one. What is a diuretic? A diuretic is anything that is going to increase the loss of water. So there are weak diuretics and strong diuretics. I just mentioned that alcohol is a very strong diuretic, drinking 4 beers, peeing out a 6-pack. There are medications that are even more powerful diuretics. Some things are very mild diuretics, but that's a diuretic, anything that causes you to lose more water. All right, what anatomical feature of the ureters prevents the backflow of urine? So ureters, they have, there's a funnel where the 2 ureters come in, the back of the bladder. There's a funnel shape, so that helps. They also, they come in at like an oblique angle, sorry to you guys, and the openings are slits instead of being big openings. So slit-like openings, they come in from the back of the bladder at an oblique angle, and they enter this trigone, this funnel at the bottom of the bladder. All of those things are designed to keep urine from flowing backwards, which is good, because if it did, way more likely to get infections and have other problems. All right, how many layers of smooth muscle are in the urinary bladder, and what is the muscular layer called? So there are 3. Other than the stomach and the bladder, everywhere else, there's 2 layers of smooth muscle, a circular layer and a longitudinal layer. In the stomach, it has a 3rd layer that's called an oblique layer, kind of an impartial or a partially produced 3rd layer. This is pretty organized. So the muscle of the bladder is going to be a longitudinal layer of smooth muscle with a circular layer and then another longitudinal layer. So it's just designed to help it compress the urine in one direction. It is called the detrusor muscle. So the muscular layer of the urinary bladder is called the detrusor. What are the folds in the urinary bladder called? These are called rugae, R-U-G-A-E, same name as the folds in your stomach. So they allow the bladder to expand without taking damage. Hopefully you also remember from your histology chapter, the bladder is made, and most of the urinary system is made of transitional or lined with transitional epithelium, which allows it to stretch and recoil without taking damage. So that's good news. Let's see. What are the three parts of the male urethra? Which gland causes problems urinating in men? So the three parts of the urethra: the prostatic urethra, the membranous urethra, and the spongy or penile urethra. So the prostatic urethra is the first part. It's named after the fact that it travels through the prostate gland. The membranous urethra, a little tiny part that leads into the spongy or penile urethra, which runs the length of the penis. So those are the three parts of the male urethra. The gland that causes problems is the prostate gland. So most glands are off to the side and squirt their secretions into tubes. The urethra runs through the prostate gland. So if you have benign prostatic hypertrophy, if you have an enlarged prostate for any reason, cancerous or not, it will actually compress the urethra and make it hard to urinate. So if a man is having to get up several times a night to urinate, they can't fully empty the bladder, their prostate gland is probably swollen. The key is why. Is it prostatitis or BPH like I just mentioned, or is it something worse? Okay, let me actually do this so I can make sure my head's not in the way. The micturition and defecation reflexes are quite similar. Are they positive or negative feedback loop driven? Which sphincter, internal or external, is smooth muscle? And what is the key difference between the two? All right, so they're positive feedback driven loops. Everyone knows of the urination. I could urinate, I should urinate, I have to urinate, I'm going to wet myself if I don't. So to me, the stimulus gets more and more powerful. That's why I call it a positive feedback loop driven. Which sphincter is smooth muscle? So just like with defecation, the internal sphincter is smooth muscle. The external sphincter is skeletal muscle. So if you've ever had to hold urine in, it's because that internal urethral sphincter that is smooth muscle has popped open. The only thing stopping you from wetting yourself is the conscious voluntary contraction of the external urethral sphincter, which is skeletal muscle. So if you've ever had to hold your urine in, you know that there's two sphincters there. The key difference is to urinate or micturate, you have to consciously relax the internal sphincter. With defecation, you just increase abdominal pressure and it pops open. So it may not seem like a big deal, but if you've ever tried to urinate when you're in a stressful situation, in a trough with men on either side of you, they call it stage fright. I don't know if it's as big of a deal for everyone, but stage fright is when you're trying to urinate, you got to think about water or listen for water because you can't get the internal sphincter to relax. So that's the key difference there. Not a big deal, but just kind of interesting. Okay. That's the urinary system. I hope this helps you grasp all these concepts. Very, very important stuff. And have a wonderful day. Be blessed.